Okay, so this is going to be the last recorded lecture for the course. I'm going to talk a little bit, just kind of circle back around with some of the security aspects, and talk about some concepts around database vulnerabilities and mitigations. Right. So, you know, the one of the challenges I think as we've talked about over the course, over the span of what we've been talking about with this over the semester, one of the things we've talked about is the need because because of these things we call databases, the importance of them, the type of data they contain, the importance of them to an organization. Um, a big emphasis, a huge emphasis, is really placed upon um, keeping them running, and then and also they can be fragile items. They can be fragile systems and subject to, damage and destruction of the data. So one of the things that becomes, we've identified as, things to be, watchful for or things to be aware of. So we've got a list here of some of the 10 common database security vulnerabilities. Um, there's not, there's not the only things, but this is a pretty, not a bad start here. So we've got failures of deployment, bad installation, things not designing things well. Possibility of broken databases. We've talked around this idea of referential integrity and things like that if something happens. Data leaks, um, stolen database backups, abuse of database features. Lack of segregation, which is kind of an interesting concept of the idea of if depending upon how you've got this stuff set up, by default, if you set up with give everybody full access, you can touch everything, every bit of data in a database. So if it's not set up correctly, we don't segregate, and control who can read what when under what circumstances. Infrastructure weaknesses, obviously the type of systems and networks we store the stuff on. SQL injections, we'll talk about that in a second. Poor key management around, especially with encrypted data, and then database practice inconsistencies. Right? So all of these together collectively, really represent some of the things when you take on a database, something the database administrators and the people doing the design work and the implementation work and people who are going to be held responsible for this have to deal with. Right? Main vulnerabilities, the main thing, one of the biggest things is people having too many privileges, people having the ability to do too much stuff. All right, so that's always a, basically, the minimum, minimum amount of rights. You start with the approach policy of minimum rights. You only do what you need to do. Um, Another big one, I think we've also have touched upon this, is the idea of default users and passwords. There's these systems, DBMSs are fairly sophisticated pieces of software. When you set them up, they'll have things like they'll have default users and associated passwords. A lot of times when people set these things up, they don't set the appropriate passwords or they don't deactivate them. All right. So what'll happen is if you come in, if you know what the database is and you know what the defaults are, you can check that to see if you have access. All right. Vulnerabilities not patched. All right. What you've got is, these systems, once again, very complicated systems. Um, on an ongoing basis, the manufacturers, the writers of these the authors of these things, so Oracle and Microsoft and IBM, are constantly identifying bugs and identifying vulnerabilities and developing patches for them. Um, but they're only as good as what gets implemented. If organization chooses not to implement patches, then those vulnerabilities or potential gateways, or attack vectors. That because what will happen is the key word here is this idea of a known vulnerability. Everybody knows about it. If everybody knows about it, you want to make sure your operations are protected. And then finally, this idea of open ports. Kind of a little like a little bit like the default networks and users and passwords. Ports, the network ports. All right. So what happens is by default, we used to see, and this is something that's kind of over history, uh, as identified, and we've been working hard to close this stuff up. But depending upon how these things are set up, by default, it used to be you would install a DBMS system, and it would activate all the ports on the system, and every one of those ports is could potentially be used as an access to get into the system. So this idea of closing off both your default users as well as the default ports, or that are maybe defined into the system, is something that's always a critical thing for the database administrators to work on. A list of best practices. It's not the only list, but it's not a bad one to start. This idea of defining policies and procedures and then following them, documenting it and creating logs, so tracking and monitoring and staying on top of it. Educating users. The users, people are the weakest link in security. So, educating people and making them aware, maintaining updates of database and security technology and implementing where appropriate. Ongoing review. So we follow the policies and procedures, and also we do an ongoing review and adjust where necessary. All right. Block direct access to database servers. One of the things that happens a lot of times is people say, "Well, I need to get directly to data," and they may or may not. But that's getting directly to access to it potentially leaves a hole that somebody can drive through. All right. Limit and restrict access to the server, both in terms of network and in terms of physical. All right. Remember what we said about physical access? You gain physical access, you basically control that system. Using strong passwords. All right. So the idea of and tracking it and effective password management systems. Changing things, defining policies that are for both strong passwords as well as changing them on an ongoing basis and monitoring and managing it. And then finally, patches, 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 patches. It does you no good to have buy a software system, a database system, world-class database system with a being supported in an excellent fashion if you don't apply the patches. So protection, profile vulnerability, the areas we're looking at, the things we're looking for. So, the architectural description, the basic functional specifications, the basic design, operational user guidance, and preparative procedures. So these are all things you want to kind of be looking at in terms of when you want to assemble a vulnerability assessment. So you kind of take each one of these things and use this maybe as a starting point for going in and doing evaluating, establishing a baseline, and then measuring against that baseline. A couple other things in terms of the security stuff. Specific actions per user. You want some things that there's features. Not every database has it. But there's specific functions that you can do to control, special questions. You're basically multi-factor. It's like an extended segregation of activities. But the challenge you run into though is also being able to do things like that, and also making sure you're maintaining the usability of the system. All right. The access, all database accesses should be maintained, should be recorded into data on devices accessible only to the database administrator, because you really don't want somebody going in. First thing a hacker will do if they get access into the system will go into the log files and erase their presence out of it. All right, so be able to make sure that you're monitoring it. You want to log activity, you want to control access to those logs, and you want to monitor and analyze those logs on an ongoing basis. And then another good one is making sure that you restrict the number of failed passwords attempts. And then monitor what's happening, activities around those. This is a very simple but also very powerful. Invariably, especially as computers have gotten more sophisticated, somebody can, if you don't enable some sort of access, unsuccessful attempt tracking, you can write a program that just simply checks and checks and checks and eventually, finds their way into a system through just sheer brute force. And that is really it for this uh, topic area.